The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse was still steaming from the cold when he reached the gates of Ashworth Grange. It bore no return address, only a single wax seal pressed with the crest of a house that had not spoken to the Whitmore family in 11 years, the crest of Ravensmoor Hall, seat of the Duke of Ashcombe. The housekeeper who received it did not know what to make of the silence that followed when it was opened. She only knew that the young woman who read it went very still, the way people go still when the past reaches out and touches them without warning. No one in the house spoke of what was written on that page. Not that morning. Not for many mornings after, but within the fortnight, that letter would carry a penniless young woman across 3 counties, into the coldest wing of the grandest house in the north of England, and into a mystery that had waited 23 years to be found. She did not yet understand what she was walking into. She only understood that she had no other choice. This is the story of Eleanor Hartley, the room no one wanted her to have, and the truth that had been sealed behind a cracked plaster wall since before she was born. To understand why a letter from a duke's estate could summon such dread in a respectable drawing room, one must go back to the autumn before, when the Hartley name still meant something in the county of Yorkshire, and Eleanor still believed her life would unfold the way such lives were supposed to, quietly, comfortably, without incident. Her father, Mr. Charles Hartley, had been a gentleman of modest but respected means, a man who had built his fortune through careful investment in the wool trade and had, for 20 years, maintained a household of quiet dignity. Eleanor was his only child, and though her mother had died when she was young, she had grown into a woman of unusual composure. Clever in a way that unsettled the matrons of the parish, gentle in a way that disarmed them again just as quickly. She had expected, as any young woman of her station expected, that her life would be arranged around a suitable marriage, a modest inheritance, and the slow, unremarkable comfort of provincial gentility. She had not expected her father's investments to collapse in a single ruinous season, nor had she expected the illness that took him only months after the first creditors began to call. Within a year, the house was sold. Within 2, the servants were let go, the furniture auctioned, and the name Hartley, once spoken with polite respect, was spoken instead with the particular pity reserved for families who have fallen. It is a peculiar kind of grief to lose not only a parent, but a place in the world at the same moment. Eleanor wore black for her father, but she might as well have worn it for the life she had once imagined for herself. She did not weep in front of others. She had learned, in those difficult months, that a woman without money cannot afford to be seen as fragile. Pity is offered freely, but assistance is not, and Eleanor had quickly discovered which was more useful to her survival. She took a position first as a governess to a merchant family in Leeds, a household loud with children and devoid of warmth. She endured it for a year. Then came a brief, unhappy position as a companion to an elderly widow in Harrogate, a woman whose temper was as sharp as her mind was failing, and who dismissed Eleanor without explanation after 8 months of faithful service. By the time the letter arrived, Eleanor Hartley was 23 years old, living in 2 rented rooms above a milliner's shop. With 16 shillings to her name, and no prospects that did not involve further servitude to households that did not want her, only her usefulness. She had never expected the name Ashcombe to enter her life again. She had heard it only once before, as a girl, spoken in hushed and careful tones by her father, who had known the old Duke in his youth, before scandal, before silence. Before the Ashcombe name became one that respectable families mentioned only in passing and never in detail. What she did not know, what remained hidden from her entirely, was that her father's connection to that family ran far deeper than a passing acquaintance from decades past. That connection was the very reason the letter had been sent to her, and not to any other woman in England. She would not understand this for many weeks yet. For now, she understood only that the letter offered her a position, companion to the current Duke's elderly aunt, in residence at Ravensmoor Hall, at a wage that would have seemed generous to her even in better days. She had no family left to consult, she had no prospects to weigh against it. She packed what little she owned into a single trunk, and within 4 days of receiving the letter, she was on a train moving north, toward a house she had never seen, in service to a family she knew almost nothing about. She did not yet understand that Ravensmoor Hall had been waiting, in its own patient and silent way, for someone exactly like her to walk through its doors. Before the story carries Eleanor through those doors, let us pause here in the telling, because if you find yourself drawn into old English houses, hidden letters, and the long shadows of aristocratic secrets, this is precisely the kind of story this channel exists to tell, week after week. If that sounds like your kind of evening, take a moment now to subscribe, so you never miss the next one. And while the fire is still warm and the story is only beginning, tell us in the comments below where in the world you are watching from tonight. It is always a quiet pleasure to know how far these old English tales have travelled. Now, back to Eleanor and to the house that was waiting for her. Ravensmoor Hall did not announce itself gently. It rose out of the Yorkshire moorland like something the land itself had reluctantly permitted to exist. Grey stone against a greyer sky, its towers uneven with age, its windows dark, even at midday, as though the house preferred to keep its own counsel. The carriage that carried Eleanor from the station moved slowly along a drive lined with elms, so old their branches met overhead in a black, skeletal canopy, and by the time the house came fully into view, she understood, with a small cold certainty, that she had entered a world entirely unlike the one she had left behind. She was received not by the Duke, she would not see him for several days yet, but by the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, a narrow woman with an expression permanently arranged into polite disapproval. Mrs. Pemberton looked Eleanor over as one might examine a piece of furniture delivered to the wrong address, and said only, "You'll want to see your room before supper. It is not the finest in the house." It was, in fact, very far from the finest room in the house. Eleanor was led up a back staircase, through a corridor where the wallpaper had softened to the colour of weak tea, and into a chamber at the farthest end of the east wing, a room so cold that her breath clouded faintly in the air, so long unused that dust lay undisturbed across the mantel like a fine grey snow. The bed was narrow, the curtains were moth-eaten, and along the far wall, running from floor to ceiling in a jagged path, was a crack in the old plaster wide enough to fit 2 fingers into. "The other rooms are being aired for guests," Mrs. Pemberton said, in a tone that made clear this explanation was not meant to be questioned. "This one will do for a companion." Eleanor did not argue. She had learned in her years of diminished circumstance that women in her position did not get to choose their rooms, their employers, or the manner in which they were treated. They got to choose only how they carried themselves within those limitations, and Eleanor had long ago decided she would carry herself with dignity, whatever room she was given. She did not yet understand that the room itself would become the very centre of everything that followed. She did not yet understand that the crack in that wall had been there, unmended, for 23 years, not through neglect, but through a silence so carefully maintained that even the servants who had worked at Ravensmoor Hall for decades did not know its true cause. That first night, as the wind moved through the old elms outside and the fire in her small grate struggled to hold its warmth, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the house settle around her. The particular creaks and sighs of a building far older than any she had lived in before. Once, near midnight, she thought she heard footsteps in the corridor beyond her door, slow and deliberate, pausing directly outside before moving on. She told herself it was only a servant, or her own tired imagination. She would later learn it was neither. The lady she had been engaged to attend, Lady Constance Ashcombe, was the Duke's aunt, a woman well past 70, sharp of mind despite her failing body, who received Eleanor in a sitting room thick with the smell of dried lavender and old paper. Lady Constance studied her new companion for a long moment before speaking, in the manner of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "You have his eyes," she said finally, and would say nothing more on the matter, no matter how gently Eleanor pressed. It was the first of many small, unexplained remarks that would follow Eleanor through her early weeks at Ravensmoor Hall. Remarks that seemed to mean something to the person speaking them, and nothing at all to Eleanor, who had no context in which to place them. The servants, too, regarded her with a curious wariness that she could not account for. A young housemaid named Agnes, the only member of the household who showed her any warmth, once began to say something about the room they gave you before catching herself and changing the subject entirely, her face gone pale. What remained hidden was far more dangerous than mere household gossip, though Eleanor would not understand this for some time yet. She met the Duke on her 5th evening at the Hall. He was not what she expected. She had imagined, from the tone of the letter and the hushed manner in which his name was spoken, a man of cold formality, and in some respects that expectation was met. Edmund Ashcombe, 7th Duke of that name, was tall, composed, and spoke with the careful precision of a man who had trained himself never to say more than he intended. But there was something else beneath that composure, something Eleanor noticed in the brief moment their eyes met across the dining room, a flicker of something that looked almost like recognition, quickly suppressed. He said very little to her that first evening. He asked after her comfort, inquired politely about her journey, and excused himself early from the table. But Eleanor noticed that he did not look at her again for the rest of the meal, and that when he did once, he was looking not at her face, but at her hands, folded in her lap, with an expression she could not name. She did not yet understand that her hands were the same shape as her father's had been. She did not yet understand that the Duke of Ashcombe had recognized her the moment she walked into his house, not because he had ever met her before, but because he had spent 23 years remembering a face very like hers and waiting, with a dread he had never spoken aloud to another living soul, for the day it might return. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Eleanor's days were spent largely in Lady Constance's company, reading to her in the mornings, walking with her in the walled garden when the weather permitted, sitting with her through the long grey afternoons while the old woman dozed and woke and dozed again, murmuring occasionally about people and events Eleanor did not recognise. It was during these long afternoons that Eleanor first began to notice the strangeness of the house itself, not merely its size or its age, but the particular quality of its silences. There were rooms the servants avoided without explanation. There was a portrait gallery where one frame, larger than the rest, held nothing but a rectangle of paler wallpaper where a painting had clearly once hung. There was a locked door on the 2nd floor that Mrs. Pemberton walked past each day without ever once glancing toward it, in the manner of someone who has trained themselves not to see something. And there was her own room, at the end of the east wing, with its crack in the plaster that seemed, if anything, to widen slightly with each passing week. She raised the matter once with Mrs. Pemberton, asking whether a plasterer might be sent for. The housekeeper's face went through a complicated series of expressions before settling on brisk dismissal. "The east wing has always been troublesome," she said. "The Duke prefers it left as it is." And when Eleanor asked why, Mrs. Pemberton had already left the room. No one in the house spoke of it directly, but Eleanor began to understand, in the way one understands a current beneath still water, that the crack in her wall was not simply a matter of old plaster and older stone. It had been left unmended on purpose. And a house does not leave a crack unmended for over 2 decades without a reason someone, somewhere, is determined to protect. It was Agnes, the young housemaid, who finally gave her the first true thread to pull. They had become, in their quiet way, something like friends, as much as the difference in their positions allowed. Agnes had grown up in the village nearest the hall, and her mother had once worked in the house as a laundress, decades before. One evening, as Agnes helped Eleanor bank the fire against the cold, she said, without quite meaning to, "My mother used to say that room was sealed up the same year the old Duke's brother disappeared." Eleanor went very still. Disappeared? Agnes's face closed like a door. "I oughtn't have said that. Please don't tell Mrs. Pemberton I spoke of it," and she would say nothing further, no matter how gently Eleanor pressed, leaving Eleanor alone that night with a single new fact glowing in the darkness of her mind like an ember. The current Duke had once had a brother. And that brother, it seemed, had vanished in the very year her own room had been left to crack and crumble, undisturbed, ever since. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow bed, watching the shadow of the crack stretch black across the wall in the dying firelight, and for the first time she found herself wondering, not idly, but with a growing and specific unease, whether the room she had been given was truly the worst room in the house because of its distance from the family quarters, or because of something else the house had been built to conceal. The following days brought small, accumulating discoveries, each one deepening the mystery rather than resolving it. She found, tucked behind a loose board in the library, while searching for a book Lady Constance had requested, a ledger of household accounts from over 2 decades past, ordinary in every respect except for a single page, torn out so cleanly that only a thin, ragged edge remained to mark where it had been. She noticed that the portrait gallery, which held generations of Ashcombe faces stretching back over a century, contained no likeness at all of any second son, no younger brother, no spare heir, nothing to suggest that the Duke had ever had a sibling, despite Agnes's careless words. She noticed, too, that Lady Constance, in her wandering afternoon murmurings, spoke sometimes of a name, Julian, with a tenderness that seemed entirely out of proportion to a man who, by every visible record in the house, appeared never to have existed at all. "Julian would have liked you," the old woman said one grey afternoon, apropos of nothing, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the garden wall that only she could see. "He always did prefer the clever ones. Foolish boy. Foolish, foolish boy." And then, as if a door had closed behind her eyes, she said no more, and would not be drawn on the subject again that day, or the next. Eleanor began, quietly and without announcing her intentions to anyone, to search. She was careful about it. She could not afford to be dismissed, not with 16 shillings to her name and nowhere else in England to go. She conducted her searches in the margins of her duties, in the quiet hour before the household woke and the quieter hour after it slept. She spoke, gently and without pressing too hard, to the older servants, most of whom deflected her questions with the same practiced discomfort Mrs. Pemberton had shown. She spent one long afternoon in the estate's small chapel, reading the memorial plaques along the walls, searching for any record of a Julian Ashcombe, and found none, though she noted, with a small private chill, that the plaque commemorating the 6th Duke's 2 sons listed only one name, where the spacing of the stone suggested there ought, by rights, to have been 2. What remained hidden was far more dangerous than a family simply declining to speak of an unhappy memory. Eleanor did not yet know the shape of the danger, but she had begun, unmistakably, to sense its presence, the particular stillness of a house holding its breath around a secret it had been forced to keep for a very long time. And always, at the centre of her searching, she returned to her own room, to the crack in the wall that widened, almost imperceptibly, with each passing week, to the strange sensation, which she could not entirely dismiss as fancy, that whatever the house was hiding, it was hiding it closest to her, behind that very wall, in that very room, the one no one else had wanted her to have. It was the Duke himself, unexpectedly, who gave her the next piece of the puzzle, though he did not intend to. She encountered him one evening in the long gallery, where she had gone to return a book to the library, and found him instead standing before the section of wall where the empty picture frame hung, the one that held nothing but paler wallpaper in the shape of a portrait long since removed. He did not hear her approach at first, and for a moment Eleanor observed something in his expression she had not seen before, not the careful composure he wore for the household, but something rawer, older, closer to grief than to anger, though it seemed, in him, difficult to separate the two. When he noticed her, the expression vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual careful reserve. But he did not leave immediately, as he usually did when they crossed paths. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, in the same searching way Lady Constance had studied her on that first afternoon, and said, quietly, "You resemble someone I once knew." Eleanor, emboldened perhaps by the strangeness of the moment, asked gently who that someone had been. The Duke's jaw tightened. "Someone this house has agreed not to remember," he said, and there was something final in his tone that told her the conversation, brief as it had been, was already over. He inclined his head to her, the barest courtesy, and left the gallery without another word. She stood alone for a long while afterward, looking at the empty frame on the wall, at the pale rectangle of unfaded paper where a face had once hung and had since been erased, deliberately, completely, by someone with both the authority and the will to make an entire portrait, and apparently an entire person, disappear from the record of a great house. She did not yet understand that the man in that missing portrait had her father's handwriting in his own private letters. She did not yet understand that the crack in her bedroom wall had first appeared on the very night that portrait was taken down. She understood only that the mystery of Ravensmoor Hall was not a matter of old gossip or half-remembered scandal, but something the Duke himself still carried 23 years later, like a wound that had never properly healed, and that whatever had happened, he had spent more than 2 decades making certain no one, not even his own household, ever spoke of it again. Years later, the truth would emerge in full, and Eleanor would understand every strange glance, every unfinished sentence, every silence she encountered in those early weeks. But for now, she carried only fragments, a missing brother, a missing portrait, a room that would not stay mended, and a Duke who looked at her as though she were a ghost he had spent half his life trying to forget. The crack finally gave way on a night of heavy autumn rain, some 6 weeks after Eleanor's arrival. She had been woken near 2 in the morning by a sound she at first mistook for thunder, a low, grinding groan of settling stone, followed by the unmistakable patter of falling plaster. When she rose and lit her candle with trembling hands, she found that a section of the wall beside her bed, weakened perhaps by decades of damp and the season's heavy rains, had crumbled away entirely, revealing behind it not solid stone, as she had always assumed, but a narrow cavity, the outline, unmistakably, of a doorway that had been bricked over and plastered smooth so long ago that no trace of it remained on the surface. She stood before it for a long moment, candle shaking in her hand, caught between the very reasonable instinct to summon help and the deeper, more insistent instinct that told her this discovery was hers alone to make. That if she called for Mrs. Pemberton, or for anyone else in that watchful house, whatever lay beyond that opening would be sealed away again by morning. And she would never know what had been hidden there for 23 patient years. She chose, in the end, to look. The space beyond the false wall was small, little more than a closet, really, built into the thickness of the old stone between her room and the one beside it, which had stood empty and locked for as long as anyone could remember. Dust lay thick over everything inside, undisturbed since the day the wall had been sealed. And in the centre of that small hidden space, resting on a simple wooden shelf, she found a tin document box, its lock long since rusted through, and beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon that had once been blue and was now the colour of ash. She carried them back to her narrow bed with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and by the light of her single candle, with the rain still hammering against the old windows, Eleanor Hartley began to read. The first letters were unremarkable, correspondence between brothers, warm and unguarded in the way that only private letters between people who trust each other completely can be. They were signed, again and again, in a hand she now recognized instantly, having spent her whole childhood watching that same hand write in ledgers and letters of her own household. Her father's hand. Charles Hartley. Writing, as a young man, to his closest friend, a friend he addressed, in letter after letter, as Julian. Eleanor read through the night, piecing together, letter by letter, a friendship her father had never once mentioned to her in the whole of her life. A friendship between Charles Hartley and Julian Ashcombe, younger brother to the man who was now Duke, so close and so constant that the two young men had once planned, in the reckless optimism of their 20s, to go into business together, pooling their modest inheritances into a shared venture that would have made neither of them dependent on their family's goodwill. And then, dated some months later, the tone of the letters changed entirely. What remained hidden in those final letters was the truth that had shaped the whole of Eleanor's life without her ever knowing it. A truth that had cost her father, his closest friend, had cost Julian Ashcombe his place in his own family, and had left a crack in a plastered wall that no one in 23 years had dared to mend. The final letters told a story of betrayal so quiet and so thoroughly buried that it had left almost no trace outside that small hidden closet. Julian Ashcombe, it emerged, had never disappeared through scandal of his own making, as the family had allowed the world, and eventually themselves, to believe. He had been the victim of a deliberate and calculated deception, orchestrated by the very brother who now sat as Duke. The two brothers had been due to inherit, under the terms of their father's will, a substantial joint fortune, divided, as was customary, unevenly in favour of the elder, but with a significant portion set aside for Julian, sufficient to make him entirely independent of his brother's authority. Edmund, then merely the Duke's elder son and heir apparent, had found this arrangement intolerable. He had, in the months before their father's death, systematically altered the terms of several key documents with the quiet, unwitting assistance of a solicitor who did not fully understand what he was being asked to authorize, so that upon their father's passing, the bulk of Julian's independent inheritance was quietly redirected into accounts and holdings that only Edmund could access. Julian had discovered the deception roughly a year later, while attempting to draw upon funds he believed were rightfully his, and had confronted his brother directly, a confrontation that, according to the last and most damning letter in the bundle, written by Julian to Charles Hartley, only weeks before Julian vanished from all record, had ended not with reconciliation, but with a threat. Edmund, the letter revealed, had told his younger brother plainly that if Julian pursued the matter publicly, through solicitors, through courts, through the scandal that would inevitably follow, he would ensure that Julian was instead the one remembered as the family's disgrace. He had, Julian wrote with evident bitterness, documents already prepared, false accounts of debts and improprieties that could be produced to paint Julian as a wastrel and a liar, sufficient to destroy his reputation and his prospects long before any court could untangle the truth of the inheritance itself. Julian, without funds, without the family's support, and facing utter ruin should he fight the matter openly, had made the only choice available to him. He had left Ravensmoor Hall in the dead of night, taking almost nothing with him, and had asked Charles Hartley, the one friend he trusted completely, to keep the letters, and the truth they contained, safe until such a day as it might matter. He had never returned. Whether by his own choice, made in bitterness and pride, or by some misfortune that befell him on the roads of a country where a penniless gentleman of unclear reputation could easily vanish without inquiry, the letters did not say. Charles Hartley, it seemed, had kept his friend's letters faithfully for the rest of his own life, hidden among his private papers, and had, for reasons Eleanor could only guess at, perhaps fear of the Ashcombe family's power, perhaps simple grief too heavy to disturb, never spoken a word of the matter to his own daughter. And Edmund, young, ambitious, newly secure in a fortune that was never rightfully his alone, had ordered the closet where his brother's remaining letters had once been briefly stored to be bricked over and plastered smooth, sealing away the one physical space in the house that still held any trace of his brother's presence, and had spent the following 23 years ensuring that no one in his household ever spoke his brother's name again. She did not yet understand how the letters had come to be hidden in that closet at all, rather than remaining always in her father's keeping. That detail would take her several more days to uncover. But she understood, with a cold clarity that left her sitting motionless on the edge of her narrow bed as dawn finally broke grey and reluctant over the moor, that the man she had been living under the roof of for 6 weeks, the Duke who had looked at her with such strange and sorrowful recognition, had built the whole of his position, his title, his fortune, upon a deception that had destroyed his own brother's life. She understood, too, why he had looked at her hands with such haunted attention on that first evening. She had her father's hands. And her father, whether the Duke knew it explicitly or merely suspected it, had been the one man in England who still possessed proof of what Edmund Ashcombe had done. Eleanor did not confront the Duke immediately. She was not a foolish woman, and she understood, with the same clear-eyed practicality that had carried her through 2 years of diminished circumstances, that a penniless companion accusing a sitting Duke of fraud and familial betrayal on the strength of letters found behind a broken wall was a battle she could not win through confrontation alone. She needed to understand the whole of it first, needed to know how her father had come to be involved at all, why the letters had ended up hidden in that particular closet, and what, if anything, remained of the true financial record that might still prove what those letters claimed. She spent the following days moving carefully through the house, her manner outwardly unchanged, while beneath that calm surface her mind worked ceaselessly over every fragment she had gathered. It was Lady Constance, in the end, who gave her the final piece, though whether the old woman offered it knowingly or in the confusion of her failing memory, Eleanor was never entirely certain. "Your father brought them here himself, you know," Lady Constance said one afternoon, without preamble, as though continuing a conversation they had been having all along, rather than beginning an entirely new one. "Years ago, after Julian disappeared, Charles came to the house, the only time he ever did, so far as I know, and asked to see the room where Julian had always stayed when he visited as a boy, before everything went so terribly wrong. I believe he left something there. I never asked what. I was not meant to know Julian had a friend so loyal as to keep his secrets even from his own family, but old women in quiet houses hear more than anyone expects them to." She paused, her eyes drifting toward the window, toward the grey moor beyond. "Edmund never knew Charles had visited, I think. Not until much later, if he ever knew at all. He had the room sealed not long after, and told the household it was for reasons of subsidence, of failing stone. I do not believe anyone questioned him. One does not question a duke in his own house." Eleanor understood then the final shape of it. Her father, grieving the loss of his closest friend and fearing what Edmund Ashcombe might do should he ever learn the letters existed, had hidden them not in his own home, where a search might one day find them, but in the one place he judged Edmund would never think to look. Inside the walls of Ravensmoor Hall itself, in the room that had once been Julian's own childhood refuge. He had trusted, perhaps, that time would eventually make it safe for the truth to surface. He could not have known that the room would one day be given, by cruel and improbable coincidence, to his own daughter. No one in the house spoke of it, because until that stormy autumn night, no one in the house had known there was anything left to speak of at all. What remained now was the question of what Eleanor intended to do with a truth so dangerous it had already cost one man his home, his fortune, and very possibly his life. She considered, briefly, saying nothing at all, packing the letters away, returning quietly to her duties, and carrying the secret with her the way her father had carried it for over 2 decades. It would have been the safer course. She had no allies in that house beyond a frightened housemaid and a fading old woman whose testimony no court would credit. She had no money, no standing, and no protection should the Duke of Ashcombe decide that a companion who knew too much was a companion who ought to disappear as quietly and completely as his brother once had. But Eleanor Hartley had not survived 2 years of poverty and diminished circumstance by choosing, always, the safer course. And she found, turning the letters over in her hands night after night, that she could not simply set aside a truth that belonged, in the end, not only to a lost man named Julian, but to her own father, who had carried its weight in silence until the day he died, and who had trusted, however faintly, however hopelessly, that someday someone would finish what he had not been able to. She chose, in the end, not confrontation, but patience, the same quiet, deliberate patience that had carried her through every hardship since her father's death. She copied the most crucial passages of the letters by hand, in case the originals were ever taken from her. She wrote, carefully and without revealing her purpose, to the one solicitor's firm in London, whose name appeared in her father's old papers, inquiring whether any record remained of the original inheritance documents from the 6th Duke's estate. And she waited, with the particular steady courage of a woman who has already lost everything once, and has therefore very little left to fear in losing it again. It was the solicitor's reply, arriving some 3 weeks later, that finally forced the matter into the open, for the firm, it transpired, had indeed retained copies of the original, unaltered inheritance documents, filed and forgotten in the years before Edmund's amendments had ever reached them. Proof entirely independent of the letters that the terms of the 6th Duke's will had once been very different from the ones the current Duke had spent 23 years relying upon. Eleanor did not go to the Duke in anger when the moment finally came. She went to him with the letters in one hand and the solicitor's confirmation in the other, and she asked, simply and steadily, to speak with him alone. The confrontation, when it came, did not unfold as either of them might have expected. Edmund Ashcombe, presented at last with the proof of a truth he had spent 23 years burying beneath silence and sealed plaster, did not rage and did not deny it. He sat instead for a long time in the low light of his study, the letters spread before him, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the cold composure Eleanor had come to associate with him. I was 23, he said, and I told myself, for a very long time, that Julian would have squandered it regardless, that I was only protecting what our father would have wished protected, had he lived to see how reckless Julian truly was. I told myself this so often that I very nearly believed it. He looked up at her then, and there was nothing left of the Duke in his expression, only a tired and aging man confronting the worst thing he had ever done. I have not slept a full night in this house in 23 years, Miss Hartley. I did not know, until you walked through that door 6 weeks ago, how much I had been waiting for someone to finally make me answer for it. He did not ask her to burn the letters. He did not offer her money to keep silent, as she had half feared he might. Instead, in the weeks that followed, he did something Eleanor had not anticipated at all. He began, quietly and without public announcement, to correct what could still be corrected. He engaged the solicitor's firm formally, authorized a full and honest accounting of the estate, as it should have stood under the original terms of his father's will, and set aside, from his own diminished but still considerable resources, a settlement equivalent to what Julian's rightful inheritance would have been, to be held in trust in the event that Julian, or any heir of his, could ever be found and identified. He also, at last, permitted his brother's portrait to be restored to its place in the long gallery, the same empty frame Eleanor had once found him standing before in silent grief, and allowed the household, for the first time in over 2 decades, to speak Julian Ashcombe's name aloud within the walls of Ravensmoor Hall. Whether Julian himself still lived, whether he might someday be found and brought some measure of the justice so long owed to him, remained, for now, an open question, one the Duke pledged, with what Eleanor believed to be genuine and hard-won sincerity, to pursue for as long as it took. Private inquiries were commissioned. Old acquaintances were quietly contacted. The search, Eleanor understood, might take years and might yet end in nothing but confirmation of a grief already 23 years settled. But it had, at least, finally begun. And it had begun because a young woman with 16 shillings to her name had refused to let a crack in a plastered wall remain unexamined. The transformation of Ravensmoor Hall in the months that followed was not the sort that announces itself in grand gestures. It was quieter than that, and in many ways more meaningful. The east wing was properly repaired at last, not merely patched over, but restored with genuine care. The ruined room where Eleanor had first slept given new plaster, new paper, new warmth, so that it became, ironically, one of the more comfortable chambers in the house, rather than the coldest and least wanted. Eleanor was offered, and after some consideration accepted, a room in the family wing instead, not out of any romantic entanglement, though observant readers of this history might reasonably wonder whether affection had begun, in the quiet months of shared purpose, to grow between the Duke and the companion who had unearthed his family's long-buried shame, but out of the Duke's genuine and evolving respect for a woman who had shown more integrity in 6 weeks beneath his roof than his own conscience had managed to summon in 23 years. Lady Constance, in her clearer moments, took a particular satisfaction in these developments, often remarking to Eleanor that she had known, from the very first afternoon, that there was something of Julian's own quiet steadiness in her, though whether this was insight or simply the fond confusion of old age, Eleanor never quite decided, and found, in the end, that it did not matter. The Hartley name, once spoken with pity in the drawing rooms of Yorkshire, began, slowly, to be spoken again with something closer to its old respect, not because Eleanor's fortunes had been magically restored by marriage or inheritance, though her position at Ravensmoor Hall did in time become permanent and secure, but because the story of what she had done, quietly, patiently, without ever once abandoning the dignity her circumstances had so often threatened to strip from her, began, as such stories do in close-knit country society, to travel from household to household, until it was Eleanor herself who was spoken of with the particular respect reserved for those who have proven, under real pressure, exactly the measure of their own character. She thought often, in the quiet evenings that followed, of her father, of the letters he had carried in silence for so many years, of the friend he had lost and never spoken of the strange and improbable chain of circumstance that had led his own daughter, penniless and unknowing, into the very house where his old promise had finally been fulfilled. She liked to think, though she had no way of knowing it for certain, that he would have been proud of how the matter was finally resolved, not through anger, not through ruin, but through patience, through truth carefully and courageously uncovered, and through the quiet insistence that even a crack in an old wall, left unexamined for over 2 decades, could still, in the end, let the light back in. The portrait of Julian Ashcombe hangs once more in the long gallery of Ravensmoor Hall, restored to its rightful place after 23 years of silence. Visitors to the house today, walking that gallery, beneath the watchful eyes of generations of Ashcombe faces, often pause before it. A young man with a gentle, unguarded expression, so unlike the careful reserve of the family that surrounds him, and are told, by whichever member of the household happens to be nearby, a brief and careful version of the story, that he was a beloved son, lost too young, and never forgotten. They are not told the whole of it. Some truths, even after they have been uncovered, are allowed to rest a little more gently than the facts alone would permit. But somewhere in that great house, in a room that was once the coldest and least wanted in the whole of Ravensmoor Hall, a young woman who arrived with nothing but a single trunk and a letter she did not understand had proven, in the end, that even the grandest houses cannot keep their secrets sealed forever, that somewhere, behind every crack, in every old wall, there is a truth patiently waiting for someone brave enough, and patient enough, to let it finally see the light. A story preserved in the quiet memory of an old English estate, carried forward not by grand declarations, but by one letter, one crack in an old plastered wall, and one young woman who refused to let the truth stay buried. If this story stayed with you, remember to subscribe so the next one finds its way to you, and before you go, let us know once more, in the comments where you watched this from tonight. It is always a comfort to know these old houses and their secrets have found their way into homes so far beyond the moors where they were first imagined.